Today we're going to be looking at the poem Talk to the Peach Tree by Sipho Sepamla, and you'll think it's quite strange to have a title Talking to a Peach Tree. That doesn't really make sense, but we'll find out a little bit later when he brings in the peach tree itself what he actually means. But we know that talking to a tree, you're not going to get an answer, all right? So I've said here the speaker makes a series of absurd, ridiculous, strange suggestions about with whom to discuss politics. So he's exaggerating who he should speak to about the political situation that he found himself in. So we're talking about apartheid South Africa here, okay? And his suggestions with birds and shadows and pets and a peach tree in the air are all ridiculous, suggesting that the conversation that he's going to have with these items is in vain. They're not going to be able to answer at all, and it's just as useful as trying to talk to those in power as talking to those of the apartheid government. We may as well talk to these items because we're going to get the same response. All right. So you'll see that the let's talk, let's raise, that let us is including the reader in the conversation. So it's not just about let me as a speaker, but let us as people of South Africa do this, all right? So let's talk to the swallows visiting us in summer, ask how it is in other countries. Right, well, swallows are birds that fly from Europe to South Africa and back in the winter, but they arrive in South Africa in spring and summer every year, and they are free. They have the ability to move around. Unlike the people or the non-white people of South Africa at the time who weren't able to move around, they had passbooks, they were segregated, they were put in certain locations that they couldn't move from, they didn't own land, okay? So if we were able to have a conversation with the swallow and the swallow was able to talk back at us, we would actually find out what it's like to go to other countries. Because we can't even move properly within our own country, never mind go to another country. The swallow could symbolize the arrival of the Westerner, someone who's come from overseas to South Africa, so an outsider, and the fact that they only come in summer means it's not yearly. It's not the whole year, right? It's a period of the year. So maybe that this Western rule is only temporary. So there's a little bit of hope there that maybe we can overcome this struggle that we're finding ourselves in, that this won't last forever. Let's talk to the afternoon shadow, ask how the day has been so far. So obviously the sun is setting and the shadows are getting longer. And if we could talk to the shadow, which of course is impossible, the shadow can't answer. That's why I've said their humor is actually created through the absurdity of the fact of trying to speak to something like a shadow, okay, and ask how the day has been so far. It's satirical, satire being humor or making light of a serious situation, because the shadow of the afternoon has witnessed the day, and if we had to ask it, how has the day been? The answer is going to be, it hasn't been great. Why hasn't it been great? Well, because we're oppressed, because we have strict rules and regulations, because we aren't able to move where we want to, because we're treated badly, we're segregated, we don't have opportunities, we don't have jobs, So, no, the day has not been great. So it's almost like a rhetorical question in a sense, if it was actually a question. What's not a question. But what he's trying to say is that he's kind of answering his own question here of what the shadow would say. And the shadow could also refer to African men that have become a shadow of their former selves, that they no longer have that power, they no longer have that culture, that spirit, that tenacity, that individuality that they so rightly deserve. And the let's continues in the third stanza. Let's raise our pets to our level, ask them what they don't know of us. So there's very much of an us versus them here. So it's like the non-white people, the majority of citizens of South Africa versus the apartheid government. The apartheid government doesn't actually know anything about us. They don't know us at all, although they think they might do. And pets are something that you own. You're like the master of your pet. So it's almost as if the government is owning us as people, that like we belong to them, we're under their control. Of course, if we try and speak to our pets, they're not going to be able to answer to us, and so that also shows that the suggestion of having a conversation with the apartheid government is useless too. There's also the idea that a pet can turn on its owner. In other words, the people of South Africa can actually fight back against the masters or the government. Then this is like a conversation, right? And then the words or the stanzas become indented here to show that this is more a commentary on the situation that must be taken seriously. Words have lost meaning. Like all notations, they've been misused. All right? So he states that words have lost their meaning, which means that talking has become useless. All right? Attempts to negotiate change with the apartheid government have failed. In fact, more repressive measures have been introduced to suppress black people. All right? So the words that we use are useless. Talking is useless. Okay? And the notations that they've been misused, in other words, language has lost its meaning. The government has told us lies. It's used propaganda to try and make us feel like what they're doing is right and they're looking after us. We cannot trust what the government says. We cannot trust the words that have been put out there. Also, just to mention as well that many non-white writers would write in symbols to pass censorship. So obviously they would get banned if they spoke directly against the apartheid government. So they had to speak in a way that was had connotations of what they were trying to say. The meaning was there, it was hidden there, but it wasn't blatantly stated. And so like this poem, for example, Talking to the Peace Tree, nowhere here is he actually mentioning the apartheid government or how badly we're being treated. He's talking about talking to a peace tree. Okay, so we've got to try and understand what he meant. What are the connotations of what he's talking about here? Most people will admit a whining woman can overstate her case. Okay, so most people will agree that whining, which has connotations of a high-pitched complaining woman, someone who keeps going on and on about a problem, can overstate her case. In other words, we don't actually listen anymore. The words remind us of the saying, the lady doth protest too much. By emotionally overdoing a statement, in other words, overstating her case, the real meaning is lost and the words are felt to be insincere. So violence was not the way to end apartheid. Violence would be reduced to whining. So our protests and our complaining and the things that we keep doing over and over to try and get our freedom is going to lose its credibility. All right. So what we've been doing hasn't been working. It's almost coming across as whining. Nobody listens to us or pays attention to us anymore. Then it comes back to the commentary, the conversation part of the poem again, where the line is not indented. The stanza says, talk to the paralyzing heat in the air, inquire how long the mercilessness will last. So if we had to talk to the heat in the air, now the air is intangible, you can't touch it, so talking to the government is like talking to nothing, okay? But paralyzing, it means you're trapped, you can't move. And so it refers to the pain and the suffering of the oppressed people of South Africa at the time, that they weren't able to go where they wanted to go. They weren't able to change their situation. They didn't have jobs. They were restricted. They were treated badly. It was like they were stuck. They didn't know how to get out of the situation that they found themselves in, right? And the heat as well. Heat is something that traps you. If it's a really hot day, it's like you can't escape it, so they can't escape the situation in which they find themselves. And if we had to ask this air, this heat, okay, which is also like a metaphor for the apartheid government being compared to heat, and inquire how long the mercilessness will last. Well, what does mercilessness mean? Well, having no mercy, in other words, no empathy or no compassion. In other words, the apartheid government shows us no mercy at all. The way that they treat us is disgusting. It's injustice. And, let's ask the air, how long is this going to go on for? We've been suffering for a long time. Long time. Let's pick out items from the rubbish heap and ask how the stench is like down there. In other words, rubbish heap, stench, down there, all relate to the way black people are regarded by the government, by the authorities. Rubbish that was something to be thrown away, something that created a bad smell or a stench. And so the tone is serious, and the intention is to describe the reality of the situation of the black people, and down there as well. If you look at the diction specifically of down there, means that we as the majority non-white people of South Africa are beneath the white people or the authorities, the government, right? So it suggests a superiority there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the us versus them, we are seen as less than. We don't have as much value. We are something that should be found on a rubbish heap. We have no value. Let's talk to the peach tree, find out how it feels to be in the ground. Okay, so here we get an idea of where he's coming from with the title. Why is it a peach tree? Well, the thing about a peach tree is, of course, the tree is not going to be able to answer, but the tree has roots going into the ground, and the ground where those roots are is occupied by the tree. The tree essentially owns that land. Whereas the black people of South Africa did not own land, and they couldn't be successful, right? They had no sense of belonging. They were segregated. They weren't allowed to go certain areas. They were put in certain areas. And so they weren't able to move around. They weren't able to own land. But specifically to a peach tree, a peach tree is something that is fruitful, literally. It produces fruit. In other words, it can flourish and it can produce something. It can acquire success. It can reach a goal. It can provide. It can be fruitful. And the people of South Africa weren't able to do that. They didn't have job opportunities. They weren't able to flourish. They weren't able to go to university. They weren't able to make a success of themselves. How were they going to improve their lives? So a peach tree is symbolic in the sense that it does own land, and it is able to be successful, and it is able to be fruitful and grow. Let's again talk to the moon going down. Ask if it isn't enough eyeing what's been going on. Okay, so the light of the moon will disappear, obviously, as it goes down, right? So this could be symbolic of the people losing hope. And of course, the moon is personified by being able to watch. It's aware of their situation. So it can see what's been going on. And so the moon, which is seen by the whole of the world, of course, means that the whole world can see the oppression in South Africa, but no one's actually doing anything to help us, right? And if we had to ask the moon, who's been witnessing, what's been going on in South Africa, we had to ask it, what is, going to happen? Have we not been suffering enough? Now, isn't it enough already? You've been watching us, you've been witnessing us, you've been seeing us struggle every day. We're losing hope here, okay? And when the moon goes down, what happens? The sun comes up the next day, and the next day is supposed to be a new dawn, and daylight is associated with new hope and all that. But this case, the new day isn't going to bring new hope for the people. It's just going to be the same repetitive, oppressive cycle, that we're stuck in day out. Nothing's changing. And then comes to the final stanza where he says, come on. The speaker says, come on. In other words, not just me, but you as well, us as people. Okay, he's encouraging others. let's talk to the devil himself, it's about time. Okay, so notice the fact that it's always talk, right? So it's talking was a way to work for change without physical harm. Okay, and now the devil is being referred to as either the president of the time or leaders of the apartheid government or just the apartheid system in general. But the devil as being like we're living in hell, the situation that we find ourselves in and the way that we are being treated by the authorities, it's like as if we are in hell and they are the devil, right? And it's about time. This conversation is needed. It's long overdue. It's needed to facilitate change. We can't keep going on like this day in, day out without some form of change. And if we look here right at the bottom, what the themes are of the poem, the theme is the main message. What is the poem about? It's obviously about life under apartheid. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. And also the desire for change, because he's saying there in the last stanza, let's do something about it. Let's not just be passive about it, but let's actually, act on it. Let's do something to try and bring about change. Okay, and there's a definite desire for change there. The tone, how does the speaker feel about the situation? Usually one word, and tone is supported by quoting from the poem. So you say, this is the tone. Why? Because of these words here. Okay. Now I said the tone is absurd. We know it's absurd because the way that he's talking to the birds and the shadows and pets and the peach tree and the air and stuff. It's cynical. He's quite negative. All right. He's got quite a negative view about our attempts to try and overcome our oppression. Hasn't worked. It's conversational because it's got the let us talk, let's do this. It's like he's talking to the reader, right? But he's also frustrated as well. He's frustrated because, the moon has been watching, the shadows have been watching, how has the day been? Have we not been suffering enough already? Why is nothing changing, right? And I've put there the indented lines, separate the conversational tone of the rest of the poem to more of a political commentary.